Most time our politicians just bring in policies too, for sure.
Incidentally, we have several more stories.
The legislature was carefully crafted to
22.2% inflation rates as of April this year. What does that say about where we are as a country?
I think Nigeria has resorted to being resilient.
The National Assembly is something that must be gotten right.
Before you call a police station, before they even leave, they'll take permission.
I don't think there's really anything on ground to improve.
We struggled, we had to strike.
The Minister of Education volunteered and said, give me 2 weeks.
It was a lie. The president never gave me any deadline.
Welcome to Global Morning here on
Welcome to the AM News.
The death toll from flooding.
Most time our politicians just bring in policies too, for sure.
Incidentally, we have several more stories.
the legislature was carefully crafted to
22.2% inflation rates as of April this year. What does that say about where we are as a country?
I think Nigeria has resorted to being resilient.
The National Assembly is something that must be gotten right.
Before you call a police station, before they even leave, they'll take permission from.
I don't think there's really anything on ground to improve.
We struggled, we had to
The
strike.
Minister of Education volunteered and said, give me 2 weeks.
It was a lie. The president never gave me any deadline.
Good morning once again, everyone, and thank you for staying with us here on Global Morning. I'm Uyag Mofwegbe, and we're live in Nigeria's capital, Abuja. It's a great Friday. They say one indication of a great weekend is how the Friday turns out. So the Friday marks the start of a great weekend. So I'm sure you're having the best of it already. It's a great time to talk about several of the issues that are facing this country right now, with the new government in place for 25 days thereabouts. Some people say it's still too early to judge the efforts of this government, while on the other hand you have those who say this government under the leadership of President Bola Tinubu has gotten off on the right foot, and you're only wishing it continues along those lines. In the meantime, the president will understand this, not in the country, he's far away in France, hopefully to return tomorrow. But then in the middle of this visit, we understand that he's taking part in discussions around giving developing economies broader access, if you like, to finance, whether it's in the area of health, in the area of business. And then, of course, he's also leveraging that opportunity to, quote unquote, drag foreign direct investments into the country. We also know for a fact that the president is meeting or intends to meet with other world leaders to discuss pathway to progress and mutually rewarding partnership for Nigeria. So we are hoping all of that will make a difference on the long run in the way the country is positioned. All right, so while all of that is going on, we thought we should also take a look at the papers this morning and see what the big stories are and where the news generally is heading. We're going to just start from the Vanguard newspaper on the show today. So let's see what the Vanguard newspaper has got for us. As usual, big stories all over national dailies across the country this morning. When you look at the national dailies, I mean, you look at Vanguard in particular, it says NLC, TUC, CSOs rise against hike in electricity tariff. A tariff hike in sensitive Carlos NLC, increased height of insensitivity to suffering masses TUC, action on fair, unjustifiable CSOs. And reports Nigeria needs $34.5 billion investments to provide electricity access by 2020. By 2030, all right, that's on page 27 of today's Vanguard newspaper. Presidency denies approving salary increase for political office holders. Judiciary, that's details of that story can be found on page 9 of today's Vanguard newspaper. But let's take a look at some headlines just above, a little above the nameplate of the Vanguard today. It says presidential poll, INEC wiped off results in Beavers. Forensic expert tells courts. And you and I know that's a hefty allegation, all right? But then they're in court now. I think that's the best way to resolve all of this. Dollar video, Kano Anti-Graft Agency boss vows to reopen Ganduje's case. We know a few years ago how that case became very topical and that video went viral. But now the man is no longer the governor of the state, and the gentleman he had actually fired then as the head of the anti-corruption agency in Kano has now been reinstated by the incumbent governor, talking about Governor Lawal, and now the man says he's going back to, he wants to revisit that case. However, the immediate past Attorney General of that state says it will be tantamount to abuse of process. It will be, as a matter of fact, in his words, tantamount to contempt of court, because he says that case is right now in front of the appeal courts here in Abuja. So we watch to see how the anti-corruption Caesar would play this one out. Okay, Nigerians have lost confidence in judiciary lawyers. That story is on page 25. Dokbesi buried in country home Agenibode on page 7 of today's Vanguard. That's talking about the late chairman and founder of DA Communications, owners of AIT and Ray Power FM. Let's quickly, let me bring my guest on the show this morning, so together we can be looking at the papers here on Global Morning. I'm joined by Iman Ozoemena, is a policy consultant, and he's here to share his insights with us this morning. Iman, it's good to have you on the show.
Good morning.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, good morning.
So I just want us to...
Good morning, viewers.
Excellent. So let's look at Tribune, everyone. Tribune is also loaded. It says NLC kicks against electricity tariff hike, says planned hike insensitive. Carlos. Of course, this story, Ima, is replicated across papers this morning. All right, the issue of electricity tariff hike. But it's not the first time we're hearing all of this. I think sometime last year, there had also been reports that by 1st of June, there will be an increase that will take effect, and so on and so forth. But power problem, or if you like, power conversation in Nigeria, for the most part, has been political as it has been economic in nature. Of course, there's also the social element of it as well. 1 minute, it is about the billing system. The next is about availability or otherwise of meters for consumers, and so on and so forth. I mean, from your standpoint as a policy expert, what has been your assessment of the situation?
Well, I think where to begin with, in the Nigerian power sector, incidentally, is such a sector that if you look at it, you rather feel sad in the sense that if you speak with anybody who is about 70 years and above, they will tell you under the colonial administration, power supply was a little bit stable, even though at independence we were about 56 million people. That was the population of the country.
At that time.
Now we are talking about 220 million as at today, So you could see the growth, but that isn't the major challenge. Then you had the Kenji, you had the Oji River, What the colonial masters did, or the colonial administration did, essentially, was to have a power mix. But since they left, that the idea of power, until we started having the gas turbines across, it was essentially hydro. You had 2 hydro power plants out there in Niger State. Before one was in Niger, the other one was in Kwara, until the former military leader Ibrahim Babangida brought in the Kainji local government and put it, as part of Niger State. That makes Niger State a power state. When they talk about Niger being a power state,
right.
That's actually the history. But I think over the years, we've not made the right investment in that sector. Not making that right investment in the sector is what we're paying for at the moment. Let's look at, that's on the part of creating that investment in power. But again, I attended a policy dialogue by Nextia. Nextia is a consulting firm out here in Abuja. A former chairman of Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, Dr. Sam Amadi, is someone I had known. We were in school together. We were schoolmates, So I take whatever he says very serious. So he says that we have not created a power market. I remember that very, very clear. There's no bankable power system in Nigeria. Under the immediate past president, we had a German investors thinking about investing in Nigeria to enhance or to strengthen the network. Till date, it had happened. So you ask, why did they pull out? I remember there was a conference in Munich where, Stuttgart or Munich, where Chairman Manda Adichie
was asking the immediate past German Chancellor Merkel
the question
about CMS,
and the German Chancellor had to look around to ask a few of her aides, and they said it's financing. So the question I want to ask, what is the financing about it?
Again, does that bring the ball back to the Nigerian authorities? When you say it's financing, that's a problem.
No. The finance is supposed to be a private sector driven process. They're supposed to go to bank, go to investors, go to finance houses. For instance, you have IFC, International Finance Corporation. Right. It's the private sector arm of the World Bank. So if you need to do an investment in education, in whatever energy, you go to them. So if you watch that video is on YouTube, watch it. The German Chancellor was like lost. But meanwhile, this is the same woman who came to Abuja, stood with the immediate past president, and they were talking about in the next 24 months, so meaning that, is it that the German company Siemens at this point couldn't get that financing in the market? If they can't get that financing, because you need to, if you have such a huge project, you need to have a financial closure, a lead bank and all kinds of whatever around that. So until you have the business case and a financial closure, you don't have a project. Is it that it wasn't bankable or what? Nobody has spoken about that. I haven't heard, a follow-up on that. So that's number one. But I can remember Sam Amadi saying that what we would have done is to create an energy market first, a power market, if you may.
We still don't have that right now.
I think what the government did under, because of the requirements and the philosophy of the 2005 Power Sector Reform Act, that required that you begin a process of privatization. So the quickest thing the government under Yar'Adua and Jonathan did was to begin a power,
like a reform process?
The reform process started with Obasanjo setting up Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, which got a lot of support from the World Bank. In fact, most of the people who managed that process initially actually came from, they are Nigerians, but they came from highly recommended. People left their positions in the US, in Britain, all over the world, and came to set up that process. But what has happened, we have not transited into a real power market. It isn't there. So perhaps what we may need to do, I have not taken time to review this current, the amended acts.
Right.
Because when you review, looking at that amended act, the first question is that, has it met the lacunas that we had in the initial 2005 Act? So that's number one. The other thing is, largely all over the world, government still has a responsibility in providing power. Because if you don't provide power, you're likely going to have industries producing beyond capacity utilization, below capacity utilization. There was a paper I read some 4 or 5 years ago that Nigeria has the lowest power per capita. Power per capita is simply this. How much of power, if you check the entire 5,000, 7,000 megawatts That's what they say, the capacity we can produce. Now, how much can the network carry? So, assuming we take 7,000 megawatts and you distribute it by the population, how much does a Nigerian have access to? Nigeria has the lowest index across the world. Power per capita, just like when you do your GDP and say, what is the GDP per capita?
Per capita, yes.
Yeah. So power per capita in Nigeria is very, very low. So that's what I think what we might need to do. The former Minister of Power, Babatunde Fashola, kept talking about power mix. So how much of power mix have we been able to integrate into the power supply ecosystem?
I want to bump in on you quickly. Two things. First, when we talk about power mix most times, I mean, in the context of Nigerian situation, it will appear it's more theoretical than it is, I mean, it's in principle than it should be
in practice.
In practice, exactly. Because I've seen people talk about power mix in places like Rwanda, for example. And you see, for want of better words, a marriage, all right, or a fusion between the principle and the practice of it. We have seen Nigerian businesses, we've seen startups from Nigeria move all the way from Lagos, from Abuja, from Port Harcourt, from Enugu, even from Kano to Kigali, just because of the way, I mean, the access they have to the basics like power and, of course, ease of doing business elements and so on and so forth. But I want to bring you back to something in the Obasanjo days. Most times when you have this kind of deep-seated conversations around power problem in Nigeria, people always want to point, amongst other things, to the $16 billion that the Obasanjo government was said to have spent within the power sector, the independent power project, and so on and so forth. Help us situate that, I mean, create perspectives as it relates to this conversation.
Okay. Under Obasanjo, he started National Integrated Power Project, NIPP. Jonathan administration came and renamed it Niger Delta Independent Power, Independent Power, whatever.
Right.
Yeah. So that's the same project. It's actually looking at gas turbine. So it was a transition from hydro to gas.
Right.
So as to expand the capacity of the power available to citizens. But then, there's a report from the House of Representatives. I remember, let me give you the origin of the report. The report came, the former Minister of Education, Obiah Ezekwesili, was the Vice President of the World Bank.
At that time.
For African region. So she visited former Speaker Dimeji Bankole, and the conversation was around power. And if I recall very well, I mean, if you check the papers or if you Google it, you can find it out. But I remember I was following National Assembly closely at that time because I was providing support to a member of the National Assembly. So the conversation was simple. The investment in power, according to Bankole, hadn't yielded any output or the measurable output. And Bankole simply said, we're going to probe it. That's how the entire power probe started. Ndudi Melu, who then represents, who was a rep from
Delta State.
From Delta State, and Ocho Shimini.
And he doubles as the chairman of that committee.
Of the power committee. And there was a Nicholas Ubane, Senator Nicholas Ubane, who was the Senate committee chairman on power. And before you know it, the House started that power probe. And Nigerians were interested in knowing what will be the outcome of this process. But you know the thing about probe in Nigeria, most of the times it starts on a high note, but before you know it, the whole thing fizzles out. So most times when National Assembly say we are probing, I'm not sure citizens take them serious. That's what I think. That's my view, but I don't know. I'm not aggregating the views of Nigeria. But for me, I don't know your own assessment. Because most of the times, they will fizzle out, they will end up in controversy, all kinds of intrigues and dynamics.
And counter-accusations.
Yeah. Well, the point there, if you watch parliamentary inquisition in the United States, in the United Kingdom, one of them is the immediate past the former British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, having to leave his seat as a parliamentarian because of the party violating the COVID party.
At Downing Street?
Yeah, you had COVID, you locked down everywhere, and you were partying. You told us about social distancing, and you were partying. But you see, so he had to, ahead of the release of the report by the Parliamentary Inquisition, he simply said, look, this Inquisition is not fair on me, the Inquisitors are not fair on me, and he left, resigned his seat. So how many people have resigned their seat over anything?
Under even more scandalous circumstances?
In fact, there's a particular senator in 1982, 81, 82, if I recall. His name is Francis Ella, Senator Francis Ella, representing one of the constituencies in Rivers. He brought up a motion. The motion was simply, we should talk about oil revenue. And the moment he brought it 3 times on the floor of the Senate, and the Senate said, look, we're not going to consider it. That's what you have today at UNPADEC, NDDC, and all that. It's Francis Ella who started it. And they said, we're not going to consider this motion. The man tendered his resignation that he won't be part of this house where issues concerning his constituency, concerning the oil bearing committee, will not be considered. He left. And then published 2-part book called, I think he called it, if I recall, the Unfinished Motions. The Unfinished Motions. That's Francis Ella. For you, a legislator par excellence. So, back to that power probe, you saw how it ended. You know, in fact, the individuals who managed the power committees ended up in, I mean, there was allegations, cases in court and overtime, and I think it took quite a while. I'm not sure I can remember the real, how it ended, but it was a long drawn legal battle.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, so back to it. Now, the question to ask now, what happened to the Oji River power plant? What has happened? The Oji River power plant were powering quite a lot of places in the southeast. We abandoned it. We're now talking about climate change. But the most industrial, the producers of the world, China, over 65% of their power source comes from coal. South Africa, I think they have about 48 or 49% coal. But we abandoned ours because of Paris Agreement. So what are we getting in return? Now the conversation now is power transition. That's the clear conversation across the world and all that. But the West are the worst polluters. Africa don't pollute because we're not industrialized.
The global West now.
Yeah, the global West. Are the polluters. Followed by China, what have you. So what is Africa getting in turn for power or energy transition? What is coming to us? I haven't seen any. There's supposed to be a carbon debt payment and all that. But they suddenly had cancelled that, and they are now introducing carbon credits and all that. But the key question is that as a country, we need to sit back, reflect, and say, look, what have we got? In northern Nigeria, you have good sunlight.
Right.
Can we leverage the sunlight and ensure that we do have a power mix that brings in solar? In the south, you might not have so much of solar operating because of the rainforest zone. If you go to Port Harcourt, Cross River, Akwa Ibom, perhaps Delta in December, January, February, there's already rain there. So for greater part of the year, you have rain in the south. So solar there would have to be a little bit, you have to tweak it. Yeah. But in northern Nigeria, wind energy, there are all kinds of whatever we can to support the existing, traditional power system.
The question, therefore, is what makes it so difficult a task for us to pull off these options?
I think the level of commitment is one. Then secondly, the Rural Electrification Agency were essentially, set up to look at this option. In fact, that's what should be their remit, as it were. In the rural areas, what are the power needs? They are not. Most rural areas are not industrialized, apart from Newi, maybe Shagamu and all that. But so they simply need a bulb light. They simply need to watch television, charge their telephone. So do they need to be connected to grid? their power needs are not as much as you have in the urban areas.
Right.
So can we say places where we have done needs assessment, because you need to do a needs assessment for a particular location and say what would be the power source to this location
that will bring maximum benefit for them.
The barbing salon, the small businesses just need. They use little power.
The POS operators.
Yeah, to operate their whatever, charge their batteries and all that. So I think we need to look at perhaps ask for views across the country. Ask people, please, how do we make power work for the ordinary people in Nigeria?
All right, great. So on that note, we're just going to quickly take a look at one more paper before we're done this morning, and that will be This Day newspaper. Let's see what This Day has for us. It says, Tinubu in Paris, ignoring Nigeria will be perilous to the universe. That's what the president is telling world leaders. There are riders to the headline. First, it says, joins world leaders to tackle debts, poverty issues, says he's prepared for business, ready for investors to come to Nigeria. Meets with Afrexim Bank, EBRD presidents, at meeting with Shetima Gates Foundation, votes $7 billion interventions for Africa in next 4 years. This is where we are leaving it with the papers this morning, everyone. But I just want to ask you this before we take a break. Zomena, the issue of Bill Gates, I mean, he's a non-state actor, all right, in his own class, for example, and he has other world billionaires, including our own Aliko Dangote, with him in all of these interventions across Africa. I mean, I've followed Bill Gates' visits to Africa since the Obasanjo days, for instance. I've seen him intervene in areas around malaria, polio, I mean, health, basically, even when we had the Professor Oshoteme heading UNICEF, for instance.
No, UNFPA.
UNFPA, exactly. So you're asking yourself, all of these investments we hear coming from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and similar other foundations across the world, have we seen commensurate outputs in Nigeria and indeed across Africa?
Okay, I would speak as an expert in you could say, donor-funded projects. Mm-hmm. I have had extensive experience around that sector. I've worked for a foundation or an intervention funded by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's called Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. In fact, that's where the current president of African Development Bank came from. Mm. You know, he was the vice president for partnership. Mm-hmm. You know, the foundation, I think, came up in 2008, 2007, 2008. They have an office in Nigeria, Accra, but the headquarters is in Nairobi, Kenya. Bill Gates has done quite a lot. There are quite a lot of other foundations. Then there is also official development aid, ODA, from countries, what you call bilateral aid, whether it's the UK development aid or the United States Agency for International Development, Swiss, all kinds of CEDA.
Right.
What has happened is that most of the impact you see, especially at the social sector, actually came from this. This is not the first time Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is designing intervention for Africa. What you call the immunization program are largely donor-driven. I mean, you could go and check it. They are largely donor-driven, but they are partnership between receiving countries and donors.
Right.
So what to ask is, perhaps what people should do before an intervention begins is to ask, where are we? So that do what they call baseline assessments and say, where are we in immunization? Where are we in polio? Where are we in this? How many percent of communities are affected, so that you can, because if you can't measure it, you can't track it.
Right.
Anything that is not measurable, for me, it's not an investment. Do a baseline study, follow the money, follow the impact, follow the results. So that gives you an insight into whether the right thing has been done, proper utilization has been done. But then, for Africa to develop, there needs to be appropriate or commensurate response from philanthropists, African philanthropists, or internal. How much have the Nigerian so-called big men invested in developing Nigeria? It's a huge question.
But people will quickly point to the Dangote refinery and other forms of formidable investments he has made in critical sectors.
No, we're not talking about business. We're talking about philanthropy.
Okay, philanthropy now.
Yeah, philanthropy. How much?
But again,
how much have they done?
There's some claim that those philanthropic endeavors are underreported. I mean, you are in the policy and
space
development space, for example. Maybe you can give insight into that.
No. What I'm saying essentially is, if you do a review of HIV and AIDS intervention in Nigeria, it's largely donor-driven, but because Nigeria is now a middle-income country, so you have donors are withdrawing in HIV and AIDS sector, so it means it has to be internally driven. So how much of the local philanthropies in Nigeria have said, okay, we're going to get into HIV and AIDS space because there are still some gaps that needs to be covered. Right. And they begin to do commensurate investment, support, and what have you in there. You have Tony Elumelu Foundation that has said, okay, we're going to look at the mentoring of businesses, small businesses across Africa.
Right.
And I'm sure they have had quite a lot of successes and investments, right, and their impact. Yeah, so I think the African big men needs to sit down, reflect, say, look, this continent has given us so much. What is it that we need to give back to the continent?
I think I'm going to just say we end it there quickly because this is a very interesting conversation we're having. All right, we're taking a quick break now, everyone. When we return, I will be looking at issues around corruption and the fights against it. We'll back shortly. Stay with us, everyone.
I am for everybody, I am for nobody. No, you not talk about me. No, in another way. How are you sure, sir? Keep quiet. I am in another way. I am for everybody, I am for nobody.
The only area where Buhari defeat for that statement. Now we are appointment. When you are talking about project, the project spell at God. If you say you need to spell at God, what does it mean? But if you say appointment, and in the type of appointment, you appoint people in church.
Like say the man na
I'm ready to say that when our leaders are the government, you know I'm telling you where they get the position then.
Why una no come win APC? Why una no win
get the na Now see, let me tell you.
Welcome to Global Morning here on.
Welcome to the AM News.
The death toll from flooding.
Most time our politicians just bring in policies too, for sure.
Incidentally, we have several more stories.
The legislature was carefully crafted to
22.2% inflation rates as of April this year. What does that say about where we are as a country?
I think Nigeria has resorted to being resilient.
The National Assembly is something that must be gotten right.
Before you call a police station, before they even leave, they'll take permission from
I don't think there's really anything on ground to improve.
We struggled, we had to strike.
The Minister of Education volunteered and said, give me 2 weeks.
It was a lie. The president never gave me any deadline.
Nigeria is in its 25th year experimenting, quote unquote, with democracy. It has been uninterrupted, and for the country, many would say it's a landmark. But one of the battles, if you like, that the country has had to fight from one administration to another has been the so-called war against graft. The question is, first of all, how monumental is the problem of corruption in Nigeria, and then what specific efforts are being made, whether it is by way of policy formulation or enforcement of existing laws, or if you like, enactment of new laws. And then how much of problem or gaps do we have within the institutional framework to drive these fights against corruption? So Ima and I will have this conversation, say, in the next couple of minutes. So at some point I get tired of talking about corruption or anti-corruption, but then it is what it is now. It stares us in the face every other day. Most times in the government of the immediate past president, Muhammadu Buhari, you would hear his ministers and other aides say, if we do not kill corruption, corruption will kill us. Who is killing who as it stands today? Corruption killing us, or we killing corruption?
Well, if you follow the political trajectory of the immediate past president, President Muhammadu Buhari, one of the things that stood him out as a leader is his anti-corruption stance. I mean, whether he's in his first incarnation as a military head of state or when he was elected in 2015. In fact, he had a 3-point agenda, if you recall. Anti-corruption,
security,
defeating Boko Haram, which was security, and the economy.
Right.
Yeah, he had 3-point agenda. But then, perhaps what we need to do is to look at the metaphysics of corruption. Metaphysics of corruption in the sense that meta is beyond. Yeah. Metaphysical, that's metaphysics. So, meta corruption. What are the things driving corruption? Why do we have corruption? Why are we battling corruption? What should we do? So we're looking at the substructure and the superstructure of corruption. The first thing to ask is, does it have a corruption, if you ask me, has a cultural element? It has an economic element. It has, if you may, religious element. And it also has perhaps psychological element. I recall a comment by the former EFCC chairman, retired Commissioner of Police, Mrs. Farida Waziri. She said, sometimes when you reflect at what people steal, that even if they have 100 or 200 years, they won't be able to finish it. So that people, perhaps we need to conduct a psychiatric assessment ahead of people taking
public offices.
So reflecting on that, that gives you that there's something endemic about it. Now the question to ask is, what drives corruption? Is it family expectation, public expectation, community expectations? If there's an announcement tomorrow that Uyi is the next, has been appointed as XYZ, I'm sure your people in Benin would roll out the drums. And that drums they are rolling out is on an expectation that Uyi is going to bring back the big elephant.
Whatever that means.
In fact, there's a documentary I listened to by Professor Ali Mazuri. The title is Africa, the Triple Heritage. I think they did it in the 80s. He was looking at, in fact, it was a collaboration between BBC and our Nigerian Television Authority.
That's the NTA.
NTA. They were looking at development trajectory in Africa. That was what the late Kenyan professor was looking at. He asked a question. He gave an anecdote. In Ghana, when Nkrumah became the president of Ghana, one of his lieutenants came to Kwame Nkrumah, Dr. Nkrumah, and said, "Sir, you know we have killed the big elephant. So what we need to do now is each of us should go and get a cutlass to cut our parts and take to our communities." The big elephant before now, under the colonial administration, was the British colonial masters managing that big elephant. But now, Africans have taken over. So what should happen? Go to your village or get your cutlass, cut as much as you can, cut and take to your people in your village. So perhaps that was that minister's understanding of development or the responsibility of governance. You know, that's a warped mentality. Secondly, there's also another cultural thing. I read it, I think over 30 years ago. Dan Agbese did, I think Newswatch magazine did a cover story on corruption. So Dan Agbese did the editorial commentary or the commentary in that paper. He gave two anecdotes. One, he looked at the then president of Zaire, Republic of Zaire, Mobutu Sese Seko, right, who was said to have, who was alleged to have owned half of the taxis on the street of Zaire. In Zaire. So somebody now responded that perhaps, or Dan Agbese concluded that perhaps Mobutu is a king. You know, in kingship or monarchy, the king owns everything in the community. If you recall in the Bible, when the people of Israel say, we need a king, and God told them, do you know what you're asking for? It means the man is going to own everything. Your wives, the best of your cattle, the best of your farmlands, and all that. So the current African governance structure is supposed to be a democratic governance system, but they are still running it like kingship. Take, for instance, let's look at the West, the Western Hemisphere. In the United States, the President of the United States should earn a salary, and his salary is made public. And at the end of his tenure, if he had written a book, if he had given speeches, they would say, oh, he earns $100,000 per hour in speeches. So you could track
his earnings.
His earnings. Perhaps that's what a code of conduct is supposed to cure.
In an ideal situation.
The Code of Conduct Act clearly states, as a public servant, you are supposed to, these are the things you're supposed to do. Declare your asset ahead. Apart from that, these are businesses you can engage in, right, which is, in fact, the only thing allowed is agricultural endeavors. Then if you had businesses before, you put it in blind trust. I mean, there are processes for that. I had suggested at a time, I think in 2007, I was on a program, you know, around transition process. I said perhaps we need to amend the Code of Conduct Act and ask for inclusion of just one provision that everybody seeking to hold public office declares his assets and put it in the public domain. Perhaps it helps. First, it will reduce the incidences of accusation and counter accusations. It will help the public office holder also know that he has a responsibility, that my money, private money, and the money of the other, of the entity I manage is different. Right. You know, so that's also very important. There's another issue that Agbese raised in that article. He spoke about, he asked a question of when you visit a big man and the people at the gates are supposed to check your boot and ensure, that's the standard practice.
Due diligence.
Due diligence, standard operational procedure.
Right.
And then on your way out, or even a public place, a ministry, a church, an office, or whatever, on your way out, you give them 10,000 naira, 5,000 naira.
As a tip.
Or whatever it is, as a tip. Or even you give them 1,000 naira, because that goes a lot. When you're coming back the next time, you're likely going to notice three things. They will salute you and ask you to pass. They won't do their job. So, you didn't intend to corrupt them. You didn't intend to stop them from doing their job. But you find out that that tip that gift has distorted their views of doing their job.
So as a consequence, there's some level of compromise now.
So if you look at the sociology of corruption, we've talked about the expectation from the villagers, from your community. We've talked about the concept of, we have killed the big elephant.
Right.
We've talked about the unintended consequences of your goodwill becoming a barrier for someone to do his job effectively. So these are the key issues. Somebody says people are poorly paid. That's another argument.
Right.
But being poorly paid is not a justification for corruption to thrive. Incidentally, one of the things that will shock us is that what we call Transparency International, Nigeria, there were 2 Nigerians who were among the founding members of TI. One is former President Olusegun Obasanjo. If I'm mistaken, he was on the board of TI. Another one is Dr. Obiageli Ezekwesili, the former Minister of Education. They were part of the founders of. And what does TI do? Simply it's a perception index.
Right.
It does. What is the overwhelming perception about corruption? So they rate countries on an annual basis, rate them,
And then release their reports.
But
I need to ask you something as we wrap up now in about 3 minutes. The former president of Ghana, all right, Mahama, is now asking the Nigerian government to adopt asset declaration in the area of property tracking, real estate tracking. He has said that. And on top of all that, we've seen President Tinubu make a couple of moves in a bid to fight corruption. We've seen that with the CBN governor, who is now on suspension and being investigated and detained by the DSS. The same has happened to Bauer, the suspended chairman of the EFCC. All right. And then we are now hearing that there is a chance that some other persons, particularly from the immediate past administration, will also be called to question as to how they managed the responsibilities that had been given to them. Do you think these efforts are far-reaching in the fight against corruption?
Well, they are good efforts, but the question to ask is, did we see it cast your mind back to in the last 24 years? 1999, there was no EFCC. EFCC was created in 2003.
2004. I think that's where the act established it.
Yeah, but I recall is the National Assembly between 1999 to 2003 that drafted it. Because I remember, I know a young man who so it was one of the bills, and that requirement came because don't toe that line, it would be cut off from the global financial system. So we had to, because there's a UN convention on anti-corruption adopted, and Nigeria is a signatory to that convention. So the next thing, we had Malam Nuhu Ribadu as the first chairman. We had he was succeeded by Larmode. Yeah, Larmode as in an acting capacity. Larmode handed over to a substantive chairman, Mrs. Farida Waziri. After Farida Waziri, Larmode came back, became the substantive EFCC chairman. Larmode was succeeded by Mr. Ibrahim Magu. Magu was now succeeded by Mr. Bauer.
Abdurrashid Bauer.
Abdurrashid Bauer. So you could get that trajectory. Even before the EFCC, you had, like we had mentioned earlier, Code of Conduct Bureau and Code of Conduct Tribunal. You have ICPC, which was also a creation of the administration of President Olusegun Obasanjo. All these are called anti-corruption agencies. And the idea is actually to ensure that you have a corruption-free environment or ecosystem where, you could say, to also improve the rating of the country, within the TI index. So the question to ask, how far have we gone? Perhaps we need to do some reflections around it. the current administration, you would say they've started on a good note. They are looking into how did you manage this, how did you manage that and all that. But another question to ask, how will it end? It's not how you start, or is it closure? Are we likely going to have a closure? There are quite a lot of issues as you speak.
Unresolved.
There are no closure. Even though you could also say it's part of the democratic practices, because currently the CBN governor is alleged. He's at the point of allegation because he's not been taken to court, he's not been tried, he has not been found guilty, but that processes, I'm sure, will be on. But the key thing we need to do as a country, I think perhaps John Mahama, having been a leader of a place like Ghana, just a few from Lagos to Ghana is 45 minutes, you're there. In fact, before the plane takes off, they say we are landing at Kotoko International Airport,
That's right.
Accra. So perhaps there are some things he knows, I don't know, in terms of the property investment by Nigerians in Ghana. He may have that impression. I thought it was that the place to go is Dubai. That was impression. There was a day, if you're coming along Kubwa Road, I think about 4 or 5 years ago, I saw an advertising properties in Dubai.
Inside Nigeria.
Inside Nigeria. I mean, big billboard. In fact, that gave me some sort of reflection. I said, oh, wow, these guys are smart. So the key thing there is, perhaps he, as a former leader, he's thinking, look, what people do is to put money in properties. I mean, there's no way you can, tracing it becomes, or tracking it becomes
difficult.
A bit difficult. There are a few politically exposed persons in the National Assembly, I think a few in the immediate past 9th National Assembly, that they published their property holdings across the world. And people were asking, how did he amass all this wealth? So, but I think what we need to do is to have some reflections. How to understand corruption is the costs on denial of amenities to the man on the streets. What I even would want the government to do, or Ministry of Information or EFCC, is to begin to interpret corruption from a practical point of view. If the local government chairman embezzles the money meant for water in a community, it means that community will be denied of access to water. Children will have to trek several kilometers to get water to take their bath before going to school. So if we move it down to that point in terms of messaging, I think it will have more impact. Even the communities may have to review their expectations of their sons of soil who are holding positions. Because I read that, was it somebody who was a former political office holder said the moment you are appointed, you begin to get calls from the members of your family, your community, friends, and what have you. So we need to actually, perhaps what we need to do, a reflection on the metaphysics, the metaphysics and sociology of corruption. Perhaps that will give us some better results.
I hope we find as they call it, willpower to do that in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead. Thank you so very much,
thank you,
Iman Zoemena, for making our time to join us here on the program this morning. I'll be talking with Iman Zoemena. Is a policy expert, sharing his own expertise and insights into some of these issues around corruption and socio-political challenges that we grapple with as a nation. This is a fine place to leave it on the program this morning. Thank you, everyone, for being a part of it here on Global Television. I'm Uyag Mofwegbe. Have a great day ahead of you.